Marty, who are you? What do you do?
You know, that latter question is much easier to answer than the former.
True.
So let's go with that.
Mm.
Although I will say that this was probably the first time that I've been describing a bio as a nuclear abolitionist, and I was super happy about that because of the full sense of that word and the historical indexicality and baggage with it that I would also embrace, and the ways that those ideologies, we can talk about that. But what do? I'm a PhD candidate at the University of New Mexico. I've just begun, starting fieldwork, which doing human subjects research during a pandemic is a special challenge, and the IRB rightly is a little bit twitchy, and I am a little bit twitchy, and of course we're all dealing with those circumstances, and will my field sites be open or will my field sites be closed? I had a trip to the Nevada test site scheduled that was canceled because malevolently handled plague. Other than that, so my major areas of focus, if you read the thingy, are what I would call nuclear semiotics, how we create meaning through signs about, around, and through nuclear weapons, and how we practice with them, what practices we do with them. More broadly, I'm interested in how humans make sense of their world in social performances and interactions. And my dissertation, which of course, right, it's a weird thing, or at least as I defended the proposal for it, is that I am looking at how people are making meaning at heritage sites, official nuclear weapon heritage sites. And in the process of writing that, it's become clear, like, I need to interrogate what official nuclear weapons heritage is, and what it leaves out, which is a whole lot. So I'm examining that, and one of the other major aspects that I kind of got into, which is kind of weird for an anthropologist, is that I got into filing Freedom of Information Act request to help add to the overall, in part to help add to the overall record, the atomic archive, as Derrida would have said, and also to provide information for my dissertation, part of journalistic efforts, and it became partly an auto-ethnographic project about, like, well, the Freedom of Information Act is clearly not here to give information to Americans. Let me assure you of that right now. If you have never filed a bunch of FOIA requests, like, it's not there to give info out. So if that's not the case, then why is it there? And so one of the things I examine are these issues of what commonly called secrecy or security, but what I would refer to as information management, because it always leaks. And, still the Japanese, for example, the United States won't admit that we probably used, I think it was cobalt in the tamper of the Fat Man device. And admitting that would help explain some of the dosage and some of the other data. And we, it's nuclear design data. We can't admit that. So
Marty,
that was a long answer. I'm sorry.
No, you're great. Marty, you mentioned a certain term, self ethnography. Can you briefly explain to us what Can you briefly explain to us what ethnography is, and what distinguishes auto ethnography?
No, not briefly. I mean, I'm teaching an intro to cultural anthropology class right now, sure. And then in trying to write out funding proposals. No, not really. It's a real challenge. Sure. Right. So traditionally, ethnography is the writing of a textual product after you've done participant observation that purports to present or explain a society or culture from their point of view, which is very exoticizing and idealistic, right? Autoethnography, at least as I'm planning on practicing it, and part of the challenge for my project is articulating a queer methodology that will answer my questions within that theoretical architecture, because of course everybody will say, well, queer methods can't exist. And so an autoethnography, right, would be, as I'm doing it, a critical reflection on my experiences of having filed these requests, dealing with the agencies, having to find legal representation because I'm going to have to sue them, and thinking through in a theoretically informed way and reflecting on that both experientially and theoretically to see what useful information can be pulled out of that that's either representative or that resonates with other aspects of my project. And so I would offer in particular that, clearly issues of knowledge availability and information management are of enormous importance, as we're also seeing with regards to the plague and its handling. When do I get to ask who you are and what you do?
Well, you can ask that now if you'd like.
Yes, I demand to know.
Okay. Who am I?
Please.
I'm an artist and an educator, and I'm located in Baltimore, Maryland, where I teach at an art school called the Maryland Institute College of Art, or MICA. And that's where I had the great joy of meeting and beginning my work with Kei Ito, my wonderful collaborator, and with Liz, the curator of this exhibition, and lots of other wonderful people who happen to be here I could have met through that MICA connection. I went there for grad school in 2014. Kei was a housemate, and we pretty quickly realized that we shared a connection of heritage, which is that Kei's grandfather was in Hiroshima when we dropped the atomic bomb and survived it, although much of his family did not. And my grandfather was an engineer who contributed work to the Manhattan Project. So when we made this connection, we understood this. We vowed that we would go on to collaborate on this theme. And by the end of grad school, we started doing that. And pretty soon after, we won a grant to make this very ambitious work called After Image Requiem, which some of you tuned in for the stream of the audio, which I annotated just before this event. And so that was a pretty pivotal moment in my work as a sound artist and kind of working on this theme that I addressed with Kei. And actually, I've got to say, Marty, you were a really important person to me in finding my way into this work. As I was kind of stepping out of grad school into the world, into becoming an educator, into delving into the scholarship around all this, one of the places I turned to was Twitter. And it didn't take me long to find you there, because you are what maybe you would disagree with this, but I think there's another aspect to who you are that you didn't directly address, which is I think you're a public intellectual. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see you're giving me.
I have a presence on Twitter.
You do.
I would much prefer the Gramscian term organic intellectual, but I doubt that I live up to that. And it's certainly not public intellectual. Dear God, no.
Well,
please no.
You do intellectual.
I yell about nuclear weapons in a public space, and I somehow got a decent following.
And you're an intellectual, so. And you're intellectual publicly. But anyway, so
2017, that trip was when we met, right? When you were doing, okay.
So I reached.
But that was extremely.
Yeah. So Kei and I, we won this grant, and we finally found when we found the right venue to show the piece, we could finally carry through on beginning to produce it, which for Kei meant starting to produce the photograms, these 108 human-sized prints using sunlight and light-sensitive paper in his body to produce these really elegiac, incredible, moving, beautiful prints. But for me, producing the work meant I had to get out to New Mexico to make field recordings at, here's your favorite term, atomic heritage sites. In particular, Los Alamos and in the area near the Trinity test site. And when I knew I'd be doing this, I took a little leap of faith, and I reached out to you on Twitter, and I think at that point I was already supporting your Patreon. I said, hey, I'm going to be coming out there. Can I buy you lunch and pick your brain? And you said, not only that,
I mean lunch.
Yeah, I want to show you around Los Alamos, and which you proceeded to do when we got out there.
That was a good trip.
Yeah, wonderful. And it was great to get to know you a little bit out there, and to kind of see you in action at these sites, and to kind of come to understand a little bit about how you do your work, both as a so-called, according to me, public intellectual, but also as an anthropologist. And so we began some conversations there, and then that I think have kind of continued in the years since. And there's so many themes and so many things that we could poke at here. A couple of things that I maybe would like to jump into would be, you kind of mentioned using kind of queerness as a perspective, as a framing, as a means of analysis. And I'm really interested to know how how you bring this to bear on your particular sub-discipline within anthropology, which is to say nuclear anthropology, right?
So is my committee. And the National Science Foundation. Although, of course, applying to the National Science Foundation, the executive order that Trump signed about that basically, I'm not quite sure what the contours are of that and how they affect that. But so I would say, in 2017, it was delightful to meet you and Kay, and that I learned an immense amount from our meeting there, and that really changed the direction of a lot of my own work and a lot of my own engagement with those topics, because in part by helping nudge me or punch me out of this sort of techno-strategic abstraction, fanboy into the technical details rut that I was getting into, which is all too easy. And that sort of nuclear, can lead into that sort of nuclear sublime and the aestheticization of it without consideration of the human, environmental and other impacts of
and when you say nuclear sublime, what does that mean?
So that's just like how fascism is an aesthetics of an extreme aestheticization of politics. So to the nuclear sublime. So if you go watch the labs a year or two ago, particularly Lawrence Livermore were big on releasing these these remastered nuclear test footage that you could sit and stare at. And it is beautiful in a sense from a particular perspective, with a particular obscuration of the entire production process before a nuclear weapon is ever detonated, right? There are issues of uranium mining disproportionately impacting Native and Indigenous peoples, especially the Pueblos and the Navajo Nation, for instance, explosive nuclear testing in the atmosphere, what we did with the Dene, with the Marshallese and so on. So in any case, by the time you get to actually setting off a nuclear weapon, it's already killed some people and injured environmentally and health-wise a whole lot of other people. And so to get lost more into oh, it's so pretty, rather than being able to remain rooted in the reality of what it is. And it springs from Burke and his theory of aesthetics, which, I'm going to try and rewrite the last 200 years of a theory of aesthetics and just say, no, this is mostly BS. The sublime is a socioculturally relative phenomenon. If you look at its development in the United States, it used to be that everybody went gaga over the Niagara Falls. I've been to Niagara Falls. It was cold and nasty and disappointing.
And wet.
And I fell into some freezing. It was awful. It was not sublime. But certainly watching the test footage, there's an opportunity for that losing into the sheer magnitude, and it overwhelms, right, our consciousness and inspires or can inspire fear, terror, awe. And there's no, you can't process it. You get back to intellectualizing. And so in that sense, the nuclear sublime can be mobilized and used, and has been propagandistically by the United States and every other nuclear power, and a lot of other techno fetishists who are big fans of, in any case, has been used in exactly that way. Look at these big, pretty explosions rather than the after effects. And I'm sorry, I forgot what oh, yes. So one of the credit, right? And this is something that you and Kay, right? So by the time I met y'all, I was already licking the bomb. And by licking the bomb, I mean exactly that, right? It's a pun on both lick as to physically lick and taste nuclear weapons casings and reentry vehicles. The phenolic resin ones taste awful because they break down into formaldehyde. In any case, spit, rinse, whatever. One of the things, and as you speak of ongoing conversations, right, one of the things that's developed for me, and this is also in conjunction with literature about forms of representation and the staying out of the sublime, is that those other sensory modalities are critical to our experience of nuclear technology and nuclear weaponry if we are going to be able to conceptualize of it as something that we built and that we can take it apart, that we can literally lick. One of the things that I picked up that you and collaborator Kay, excuse me, as I like to collaborator Kay, because for a while you were always just collaborator, that I really got out of that was a need to start paying attention, more attention to those aspects and to the emotional affective constructions in the museums, and to things like the taste and the sound scape that were being created. And that's been enormously productive in working through the literature and in working through how to think about analyzing heritage as a space. I would also say, you know, one of the things that y'all prompted me to do is also start questioning, like, what is heritage? Why this? Why not that? And I would note that both, that you just referred to both you and Kay as having a particular heritage, which is a fascinating term, or at least a contested term, rather, because heritage is always happening in this political field, right? And so if we go to Los Alamos, as you yourself saw, virtually no mention of the people killed, injured at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and certainly not in the production process of the bomb.
It seems to me that so often folks want to invoke heritage in order to maybe declare their kind of authority, right? So what Aristotle on rhetoric would call ethos, right? You're standing to be able to make a claim, but they don't want to invoke their heritage so much to maybe have to be responsible, right? Not to say that you're responsible for what your forebears did, but maybe you're responsible for an appropriate and thoughtful response to it, right? And so I think that that's a really important part of what happens and doesn't happen at atomic heritage sites.
Absolutely. And it's so the Department of Energy refers to, for example, legacy sites and legacy waste, although they will sometimes use the term in written and in spoken discourse of heritage, but it's usually legacy, which of course I would argue implies, sorry, my allergies are going, it's Albuquerque, it's the weirdest place that it goes into winter and your allergies go nuts. Winter, it's like 80 degrees. Right, legacy implies a particular temporal and institutional break, right, that heritage does not. Heritage implies, I would argue, a particular continuity, and it's an extremely political term, you know, or politicized definition with a history, right? Heritage, at least official heritage, that which is chartered by the state and associated with a particular set of disciplinary practices, and art falls into this too a lot of the time, right? Especially when you start talking about a national patrimony and the use of heritage. By the way, I did not answer your question about queerness at all.
That's fine.
We can go back to it. Does have relevance. We can go back
let's go back to it. But I just want to say real briefly to tie back in something else you mentioned. So you mentioned the nuclear sublime before, and now we're talking about heritage. Part of the way that I feel it's important for me to treat my relationship to my heritage in the work that I make is to avoid the seductiveness and the allure of the nuclear sublime, right? So I've been criticized, about the way I created the audio for After Image Requiem, in that I did not, it wasn't more spectacular. It wasn't more violent. I did not directly portray the explosion, right? So this has been something that people seem to sometimes want from the piece. To me, it's important to resist that and to leave space for Kay in his prints to portray the violence of the act, right? And to get at the ways that it's kind of violent in structural ways, leading up to even, trying to conduct a test in the ways that you mentioned before, right? But to not make something that is spectacle just because it's what we want and what we know and what we expect, right? And I agree, we both grew up with plenty of that. I think we've talked about this. The first CD I ever bought was "And Justice for All" by Metallica, and the first song was "Blackened," and it's a song about like the destruction and kind of a blackening, just charring of the world, and that was very striking to me. And one of the earliest movie-going memories I have is watching Terminator 2 and seeing that famous shot of the person getting reduced to a skeleton, right, by this fiery shockwave. Yeah, so there's been plenty of images made that that revel in this sublime, and I don't really see what the value is of me doing the work that I do, trying to just do that again and again. But anyway, yeah, queerness.
Can I touch on that actually?
Yeah.
Because when one offers, so one of the responses to a critical response or a critique of current presentations of what I have referred elsewhere as basically a nuclear mythology in official nuclear weapon heritage sites is, that you're being revisionist and, well, what about these other parts? And what you said, is these other parts are told repeatedly again and again and again in many other fora and, are basically hegemonic. Like the conversation that I just loathe having is about the role of nuclear, the U.S. nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and ending World War II or its lack thereof, because it is an article of faith in the United States generally that the Japanese, and it's all, of course, wrapped up with particular imaginaries of race and racism and but we'll not get into that here. However, at the heritage, official heritage sites that I've been to and that I've looked at in the United States, that same story is repeated over and over and over again. And it is wrapped up in really problematic, not really problematic, but straight up oppressive, racist tropes, not, carried forward from the past and not examined and reiterated. And a particularly intense US form of techno enthusiasm. And then also, as someone has commented, if nuclear deterrence is your religion, Hiroshima is their first miracle. And it's also bizarre to me that that Nagasaki is so often either elided into Hiroshima or left out. And as anthropologically speaking, I don't really know why that is. If it's because in part it's an outlier, if I don't know. It's a really fascinating question to me, worthy of future exploration, which again doesn't answer your question at all.
Yeah, there are a couple of guesses I could take about it, but I feel like I'd be probably speaking out of turn to do so. But I feel like probably what you just were saying is already informed by your kind of queer perspective, right?
So one of the things that I would argue is, that nuclear projects in the United States have been, fundamentally heteropatriarchal from the beginning. From the
draw that out a little bit.
Yeah, from the straight up exclusion of consideration for security clearances of people who did not meet a particular classed and racialized notion of sexual propriety and behavior and class behavior. If we look at, there's the wonderful book, Lavender Menace, The Lavender Scare. But the historiography is very, very clear in that, and this is one of those things that has consistently held back U.S. diplomacy, is that sorry, I'm going to drop an F-bomb here, forgive me, is that basically diplomacy is for faggots, is kind of the U.S. position on this. And when we look at the beginning of the McCarthy era, it began in part out of this extraordinary moral panic about so-called sex perverts in the State Department. And the State Department was uniquely vulnerable to these sorts of charges because diplomacy being viewed as weak and feminine. And I mean, this history in the US, Teddy Roosevelt and and so to be more precise, the Manhattan Project was an explicitly racialized, classed, and sexualized project in the way that it excluded certain people by not allowing them security clearances, by constricting what roles they could play, and that continued as those anti-queer policies became more institutionalized as World War II ran down, and then after the war, and we came up with the idea of being a security threat. Up until Clinton, in the 90s, you could still be denied a security clearance solely because of sexual orientation. And I would imagine actually that the denial rate is still probably disproportionately high because the security clearance process is also a form of social management that, what a surprise, manages to bleach and remove a lot of women from the process. So that's one aspect of it. Also, nuclear weapons in terms of discourse and practice and ideology have always been tied up with the nuclear family. I think the first use of the term was in the 10s. It's debated, but the nuclear family was a Cold War project basically, and are something like 5 to 10% of society's studied in the ethnographic literature use the sort of quote unquote kinship model we have where, right, the newlyweds go off and live in their own home and it's incredibly consumptive and demanding. And like, there are reasons that it's not very widely practiced, I would argue, although that's a little bit functionalist. But as a project of like being the supposed cornerstone of the American way of life and of Western civilization and all that, absolutely, like straight up a Cold War project articulated to issues of civil defense, of gendered imaginaries of nationalism, of gendered imaginaries of masculinity. And one of the things that queer theory holds, right, is that heteropatriarchy and heterosexuality as social projects are fundamentally failed and always contingent and in threat. So if you Google for like crisis of masculinity, it's been a thing since the 50s, 40s, 30s, 20s. I mean, we are talking like in the Cold War. So Kennedy almost got us into a nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis, in part through, like, literally, if you read the XCOM executive committee transcripts, right, the role of domestic politics and the role of needing to be hard and, you know, firm and, right, and a particular image of liberal masculinity is very clear. So one of the questions, research questions, that gets operationalized out of that is to ask how those imaginaries, those presentations of nuclear weapons through those lenses that tend to erase women, not to acknowledge the disproportionate impact on already marginalized and oppressed peoples, the role of colonial genocide, et cetera, et cetera. What are the roles of those presentations in helping to shape our beliefs and knowledge about past, present, and future violence and nuclear violence, and the state, right? Because in these heritage spaces, and this is a prime thing that museums, including art museums, Carol Duncan's work, which I said I'd send to you and then never did, demonstrates very well. The Louvre, right? We're going to kill the king and then turn, I know I just butchered the pronunciation. I took Russian with the Louvre, right? We're going to kill the king and then we're going to turn their palace into a national, you know, art thing, right? Heritage is inextricably tied to nationalism, especially in the museum form. And so when you go through these nuclear myths, right, it helps to create both a notion of who is a citizen, who is not a citizen, and also what is your relationship to the nuclear state, especially a nuclear state that like the Russians know what the yield of the Mark 54 Davy Crockett was. So do I, because I worked it back from the test documents. But technically, it's not declassified and we don't know. It's a mystery.
And so for those of you who don't know what that weapon is a very small,
54, 60 pounds.
As small as you can pretty much make an atomic bomb, right?
It was the smallest yield, but not the smallest diameter. The smallest diameter was for the 6-inch self-propelled artillery,
which is ridiculous.
Yes.
So if we could just quickly tangent and say that there is this notion among military types that you can in some ways successfully use what they call a tactical nuke, right? So as opposed to a strategic weapon, which is a whole city and takes out vast populations and resources, really. Right? Yeah. So the idea is, we can make a nuke that's real small, maybe only kills a few people. Well, how does that play out with deterrence, right? A nuke's a nuke, and it's going to likely, right? So
yeah, I mean, I've long argued, and I've become increasingly strenuous. So this is one of the things, right, about that autoethnography, queer autoethnography, is good for. I would argue. So my experience of the plague is also inextricable from my experience as a gay man who grew up in the shadow of HIV/AIDS and the government's non-response to it, and being terrorized about HIV/AIDS and a lack of information, and sex and right? The parallels are there in terms of my experience and in terms of others and other people, and of also people who have already been oppressed and marginalized. I mean, that our health, we know that our structural racism and Train of thought. Queer critical ethnography.
Actually, I think this is a good pivot point. You've kind of segued into what I wanted to ask you about next. I want to do a quick little bit of housekeeping, which is to invite folks to throw questions you have in the chat. We will, at some point during the 6 o'clock hour, pivot to outright Q&A. we want to kind of keep things loose. And if you all have something to contribute to what we're bantering about, we'd rather hear from you and kind of have it find its way in.
I talk too much always, so
you talk just enough. It's perfect. So you mentioned the plague, and you mentioned the prior plague, and of course they are politically inexorably linked. And even in the personage of our vice president, who has, presided over two outbreaks and
super
presided over them, in ways that were very, very awful and damaging. But I wanted to ask you what insights you might have been gleaning in this era, in 2020, into bunker life, right? As we're all locked down, stuck in our houses, what have you learned about the actuality and the practicality of that kind of imagined way of living, which, for the most part, in the United States at least, has not had to become a reality until now?
Well, we've chosen not to,
Yeah.
and take the proper measures in response to, and the response has been outright genocidal and malevolent. I mean, proper personal protective. Coop, Surgeon General Coop, for instance, during HIV/AIDS, sent a card to every household. We got one of those cards this time around for SARS-CoV-2, signed by Trump, and that was when it clicked for me. Like, oh my God, oh my Cthulhu, I don't think that this has happened ever before. That the CDC has sent out a card to everybody except in those two cases. I could be wrong. I don't think that there are a lot of really good analogs because, after a nuclear war, there will be no Zoom. The stress level, this is one of the fundamental problems, right? This is one of the fundamental problems of when we were doing civil defense and looking at civil defense testing for, where people would go in and live in the bunker for 2 weeks or whatever. And it's like the test results from the military side would say things like, they had a 3-day pass to look forward to get through the 2 weeks. And that when cigarettes weren't restricted, there was less conflict amongst the group, right? And if you read the shelter management manuals, I mean, they're complete and absolute fantasy documents, in part because shelter spaces were not really, those that were identified and marked were largely in urban areas that would have been glass or burning heaps of rubble anyway. And private shelter is, right, it's just really difficult to replicate the stress of a civilization-ending nuclear war, in things. So I would say that what if we could glean anything from this is the psychological distress. So one thing I have argued about civil defense is that it failed both in the Soviet Union, which you would imagine we have portrayed as having the ability to push this policy on people. And certainly for some members of the US defense community, Soviet civil defense has been it's a thing that they imagine as allows them in any case. We can talk about that later. But one of the reasons that it failed in both countries and both countries' civil defense administrations were straight up that it failed, I would argue, is that it was never able to offer either the leadership or the population a view of a life worth living after a nuclear war. One that didn't involve the complete destruction of basically everything they loved and all of the social attachments that made, we are social creatures, sociocultural creatures. And I think we can perhaps draw some analogy from the plague in terms of the psychic distress that's being, how deeply some people want to get back to going to a fucking bar. And it's that's a bad idea. And yet we're opening, restaurants are still open in New Mexico, even though we're headed toward uncontrolled spread. And it's once the aerosol data came out, having an inside space like that was just, that's the thing that's probably least realistic about a movie like The Road, is there's no bars. I mean, everybody would drink the booze quick. So I have a really, really, really not funny, but grimly funny, meme with the galaxy brain, from the normal brain to the galaxy brain take. And it's predicated on a joke about the supposed less value worth of older people or the elderly, and so it makes me feel terrible. And also to share it, right, it starts, so after I'm on a lot of medications to keep me alive basically, and the supply of that, whether from an interruption in supply of that, whether from a pandemic or even a small nuclear war between India and Pakistan, is very worrisome. And so I was thinking like, oh, hey, I can just go, so it's the normal brain, and it's like I can go rob a drugstore, and then it's the bigger brain, and it's like everybody will do that. I'll go, rob a veterinarian, and then the other, galaxy brain is I live across the street from a retirement home, which is not a funny joke. Like, it's really fucking disturbing and awful. And that's some of the directions that thinking about those topics go. And we see that same sort of devaluation of those lives explicitly in the discourse around opening up, right? We can just, the elderly, they've had a good life, they should die for the economy. It's outright genocidal, and it's outright eugenic, actually. And I would argue that much of the pandemic response, and you saw that with civil defense also, right? The self-reliance and the self-help mentality and ethos, in part because it was really expensive and difficult for the government to go in. Yeah, it's all related. At the end of the day, it's all related. So when I talk about nuclear abolition, or world peace through nuclear abolition, I mean, the same sorts of social imaginaries and ideologies that allow us to live in a police state where there is no accountability, the police can riot for months and execute people on the street with zero accountability, basically, are the same ideologies that lead us to daily make choices that maintain a nuclear doomsday machine that can kill 100 million people in less than a fucking week. Sorry, that was quite a rant.
I think it was beautiful and poetry.
Too kind. And I forget what even the original question was, honestly.
I was asking if you had drawn any kind of insights from our current situation. And I think
so
you did, yeah.
And I'm not the only one. Rand, for instance, back in the day, Rand had a report attempting to compare social disruption after the Black Death.
By Rand, you mean the Rand Corporation, which was like the
research and development by the U.S. Air Force. If you've ever read Carol Cohn's Sex and Death in the Life of Defense Intellectuals, which is, I should have provided a link. It's online, Google it. I mean, those are the sorts of people she's talking about, right? People who, So Rand, the Rand Corporation, which is mocked as the Bland Corporation in the movie Dr. Strangelove, tried to say we can examine social disruption after the Black Death as an analog for after a nuclear war, which I think is a gross. I mean, there are some insights, and it is also not even grossly analogous in many ways, most ways, other than to show, for example, the importance of coordinated, right, federal, state, local response, which is not going to be an option after a nuclear war because there won't be any of those government structures left, and the importance of that early involvement in a pandemic. Right.
Maybe we've gotten a little taste of that lack of coordination.
Mm-hmm. Yes. No, absolutely. I mean, this is except imagine this times a million, and there's no food, there's no fuel, there's no oil to raise your food. Like, I'm personally, a little bit worried about food security here. Sure. But I also have a raging anxiety disorder, and, our supply chains this is getting away from art. Except in a sense of, right, ephemerality. And I would argue that there's a certain ephemerality to the work that is on display. And that's, right, the ephemerality of the human body and of life. And we can talk about also this sort of, but our supply chains are very delicate. And so it's that delicacy of human life and the world that we have built up together, and the challenge that nuclear weapons and their existence and their production pose to that, all mesh together and relate. And so that's one thing that, queer auto ethnography can help us to realize, are these connections and associations that a more formalistic analysis or examination don't.
And as part of that, the fact that probably queer folk have not been able to take as much for granted, right? So I think probably queer experience has always felt ephemeral and kind of at risk.
I mean, I'm a fairly cis white, my experience as a queer man in America. And I mean, I grew up in Louisiana, certainly there are many ways that I remain class privileged, remain highly privileged. And at the same time, I would also point out that like most of the men in my family are kind of right-wing assholes, and I'm not. And well, I hope I'm not the former, and I hope I'm not the latter. And it's like, well, what's the big difference here? I was like, wow, maybe it was that experience of teenage marginalization,
Right.
or not, but I think for me, at least, it did push me to, right, but who cares? Like, you can look, everybody should be able to look, especially at the world now, and the injustices are so gross, obvious, glaring, and compelling. We should be responding in much more forceful ways than we are.
Right.
That said, yes, my feeling of threat after Trump and certainly increased. And I mean, certainly we see political attack. Yeah.
So, Marty, I want to pivot again and ask you about another area of the work that you do, and that is in kind of collecting and thinking about and talking about and writing about advertisements. I'm going to do a screen share here and kind of put on a kind of a looping cycle some of the materials that you shared with me, and ask you to tell us about what they are and what they mean, and we can maybe talk about some of
What they
those.
mean.
What they mean.
Right. Something always means something to someone in some situation. And so that's the whole thing. One of the whole things about the way that anthropology has handled semiotics and the way that it's developed is this: it always involves information outside of the immediate communicative encounter. The Los Alamos ad, like this one, are really fast. So these are all from a project I did in which I went through 1954 to 1964, 1950 to 1964 in Physics Today and Scientific American, and pulled out. It's not representative. It's not complete, although the ads for the labs are fairly representative of all the varieties, and pulled out ads about nuclear weapons and defense technologies and so on. And a lot of them are really neat graphic design. A lot of them are very jaw-dropping, and also you can see like the influence of high modernism in some of them. But Los Alamos made an explicit effort in the 50s and 60s to, for example, this ad. And this one has one of the greatest euphemisms I've ever seen. Oh, no, sorry. It isn't this one. It's another one where it says exploring the curve of binding energy. And it's like, that's a euphemistic way to put it, right? These sort of lush, colorful, graphic designs. And this is sort of what I would refer to also as bordering on the nuclear sublime, where it's an aestheticization. We get to enjoy the pretty pictures and the technical details and the sense of progress and advancement and exploration and all of these very other colonial tropes around science and nature and masculinity, right? How man's accelerating progress toward mastering his environment. And it's an original painting by Louis Rabat of Taos. So they were Los Alamos was hiring the Taos modernists, I think they were, whatever the art movement was at the time, to do a series of artistic interpretations for things like thermonuclear fusion, containment for fusion energy, or in this case, for man's accelerating progress. Another one is for clandestine nuclear testing. And it's like, and there's a relationship, or it tells us something about the social processes of placemaking and identity claiming, and of right, the way that Los Alamos was representing itself artistically by drawing on these particular non-representational artists, although that one is, okay, so this one is just terrifying. Like if you look into it, you can see faces that look like they're screaming, and it's about ingenuity. And I'm serious in the lower corner and in the middle. And it's about, yes, the application of creative imagination and situated in the geography and culture of the old Southwest. So, I mean, these ads are also highly colonial, and they're drawing on these artistic, non-representational practices to do social work.
Right.
And I think this is part of the sublime.
it's interesting to me how many kind of registers this this ad is attempting to work on, and it just does not gel at all, at least to my eyes, right? Yeah, you have this rhetoric up here, and this logo, which is attempting to be both very
Bow
modern,
tie
kind of
and
like, yeah,
hair
it's trying to be
production.
both very modern, and like here we're depicting valences, right? But also using a and Henry Becker, who's here, can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's using this kind of slab serif font that is meant to kind of evoke the West and kind of older printing processes. You have this kind of very abstract, expressionistic ink looking kind of painting down here, which is kind of leaving you space to see faces or see whatever you want, to kind of feel something. And
Oh,
then
that's a face.
this very architectural kind of rendering
Mhm.
of a geometric form, and like it doesn't make a lick of sense, but you can really get a sense of what they hoped they were about and what they hoped to project they were about, and they just slammed it together here. Just how many signifiers can we can up together and hope that someone will buy it, open it, and swallow it whole?
For what it's worth, anthropologically, looking at, or the way that I've been trained, right, is to consider any sort of textual, any sort of discursive production process as a process that involves multiple audiences, multiple, right, principles. The ads for Los Alamos, as far as I can tell, were all like these. This is modern high-speed computing, right? Were handled by Ward Hicks Advertising, which also, as part of a project with New Mexico, came up with the Land of Enchantment thing. So I haven't been unable to find clarifying records as to what the exact interrelationship between Ward Hicks Advertising, Los Alamos, the Taos artist, and so on were, and how that gelled in the final product. At the same time, when we look at these ads as a group, and I have until I'm nauseated so many times, there are obvious similarities across them. This is one of my favorites, right? And the presence of that high modernism I am not an art student, high modernity, the non-representation, non-representality, whatever.
Yeah.
The techno abstraction to it, the focus on technical details, and then all rooted in this kind of not counter discourse, but this complementary discourse of old Southwest and exploration and frontiers and taming. And there's an ad called Warheads somewhere in here that is a perfect also example of the use of those tropes by Sandia to claim a heritage and a lineage in both their location and in their work.
Marty, we have a really good question in the chat, which is there any nihilist impulse in the nuclear sublime?
Yes, I mean, just like in fascism, which is not to say that the sublime is always inherently bad, or that its mobilization is always inherently bad. I think that as I am defining, how do you think about 1 million people dead? How do you think about 220,000 people dead? For me to say that 200,000 people dead is, according to modeling on Nuke Map, the equivalent of detonating a 90 kiloton nuclear weapon over the White House lawn is one way that I think about it. You can multiply 220 times, 150 pounds and think about how much human flesh that is. And that's kind of like gross, but like, it's also very visceral and very present in a way that a number like 220,000 perhaps isn't. The sublime, Burke would have argued, fuck Burke, all right, and most of the other aesthetic theorists since then who have dealt with the sublime. Again, it's a relative sociocultural phenomenon. So I'm going to talk about the American sublime and the American nuclear sublime as I understand, experience, and have researched it. Yes, with regards to the nihilism, as it's been mobilized in propaganda and as it's oftentimes present in public discourse, the nuclear sublime tends to offer an aesthetic phantasmagoric experience that also leaves the viewer or the experiencer without any sense of agency, efficacy, or ability to impact nuclear policy. And, that nuclear weapons are this ethereal thing, sublime, outside of our experience, outside of our reach, something that exists and have always existed and have no history.
Right. Marty, I want to ask you a couple of the questions, or raise these questions that folks submitted when they registered. And one of them we talked about a little the other day in our prep meeting. It's a quote from the New York Times, and I'll read it out to you, and I'm going to ask you your opinion on it. So the questioner asks or says, I read an interview in the New York Times where an anthropologist spent a lot of time with nuclear physicists. And this is what he said. I came into the project like many anti-nuclear activists, convinced that the bomb was a threat to human survival, afraid of it, full of bad dreams about it. Interestingly, over time, I absorbed the weapons scientists' sense of ease with the bomb. I no longer have bad dreams I used to have about nuclear war. In some ways, I'm like the monogamous anthropologist who has spent years with a polygamous group. Seeing men with 4 wives comes to seem natural after a while. But then, I think if you're not changed by the culture you've studied, you haven't done the field work properly. What are your thoughts on those statements, Marty?
I'm making notes, sorry. I believe I know the anthropologist in question, and whose work I respect greatly. And one of the things, so I think that's Hugh Gusterson, and his response, so his explicit project, as he has said in other writing, was to examine Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and the nuclear weaponeers, as anthropology had traditionally and extremely problematically examined exotic others. And in this case, as, a unique, like an isolated group that had lost its central ritual and meaning-making practice, which was explosive nuclear testing. Gusterson tells a story about how he went to give a talk at an audience that I was literally dreaming about talking about this last night, actually, which is weird. Deja vu. But where he gave a talk, and one of the lab folks showed up like in a loincloth with a stick with a skull and a rattle on it that he would shake at him. And as Gusterson pointed out, we can learn how fascinating that these people don't like being studied, because, to be studied by anthropologists, and I've experienced this also, is like, wait, I thought that you people, studied exotic others in faraway and distant places. And like, yes, that was our more racist time. And we still sometimes do that, and it's not always horrible and racist. But so one of the things that Gusterson talks about is the need for a shift in how anthropologists practice. First off, that those models of exoticized others and our traditional tools of working with them, particularly in societies where we are studying up. And the people that we are working with, studying, or researching also have the ability to severely restrict our access to them. And in the case of nuclear weaponeers and nuclear weapons topics, that's extremely the case. So Gusterson argues for polymorphous engagement, which I would argue is also what I'm doing. None of that touches on your fundamental question, which is about the change in people doing field work and the quote unquote cultures that they study. As an anthropologist, I think it's really weird that I know some of the technical detail that I do. And there's no anthropological reason per se, although it's having a certain degree of subject matter expertise or knowledge about nuclear weapons and nuclear topics is important to be able to analyze them properly, but certainly not to the degree that I have. And part of that is because of the path that I chose to participate in the open source intelligence community and the non-proliferation community on Twitter, and to become, a freelance researcher in some ways, and to work. So, I mean, in a sense, like, we had a UNM PhD student who did her dissertation at Los Alamos, Laura McNamara, and she ended up working on knowledge preservation efforts after the end of explosive nuclear testing, and she got a clearance and all the sigmas, and she has spent her entire career in the lab since. I will not do that. No judgment, no critique. Like, A, they would never give me a clearance. B, I don't want to work for the labs. C, this is one of those areas where queer ethnography can be really valuable about picking apart those sort of emotional, affective, and cognitive changes and responses to field work and to working with and researching people. I would say that in the last couple of years, and this again is something that, you know, meeting and discussing with you and Kay and other artists and other people that I have worked and collaborated with and engaged with and so on, I have become much more, and also as a result of grad school, right, and critical theory and so on, that I've become much more concerned and self-reflexive, like a good anthropologist, about those potential changes with myself. So it's also something that you know, the registers that we speak and the way that we react to things are always multiple. And so there are parts of that register that I can switch into. And like with conversations with you, you know, there have been times where I paused and it's like, I'm sorry, I don't know any other way to express this horrifying reality and concept other than through this highly techno-strategic abstracted term. And so in part, I'm not saying that like tomorrow our thinking about nuclear weapons would change if we change the lexical items and grammar that we use to talk about them, although it might have an effect. But our language that we use to talk about nuclear weapons is at the very least reflective and reinforcing of certain very problematic issues.
Yeah, I find that this is my interpretation of what you do. You serve.
Also, I would reflect the question back to you as well, if I may interrupt.
Go on.
No, I would reflect the question back to you in terms of your study and your art.
I'm not an anthropologist.
But you're an artist, and artists are expected to have some reflexivity about and the Atomic Photographers Guild is
Why
a great
won't
resource.
You let me dodge this question?
Because
let me say quickly that my perception of you and the work that you do, especially publicly, is that you serve as an interesting bridge and maybe a little bit of an arbiter, where you are clearly kind of fairly at home in this world, in this technocratic kind of world, right? So like you can talk the talk, you understand what a lot of these conversations are about, but you always seem to bring it back to the reality that these folks are abstracting away, and you're pretty diligent about doing that, and you do so in sometimes very direct emotive terms that I think are appropriate and wonderful, and
I really like
darkly
and
darkly funny. And I think that you are an invaluable public figure to the degree that you are for that service that you provide. You call out this world on its BS and remind it about what's at stake, when so often folks are talking in numbers and abstractions and really deep jargon, right?
Can I respond to part of that?
Oh yeah, please.
I mean, on its terms, deterrence, you know, I mean, I was a political science undergrad. Like, we could have gone into that and continued with that and ended up on a really, in a parallel universe, there are many versions of myself that, like, I really don't like, right? Deterrence theory on its own terms and on its own numbers falls apart. And so, however, our discussion, like, we've known that, and it was valuable, I think, to be able to argue it on both sides, actually on all sides, not both, because if you listen to many of the, I'm trying to think of a proper term here, many of the deterrence advocates, true believers that I know, regard folk who are working to reduce to abolish nuclear weapons as fundamentally rooted in an opposition based in morality. And their response would be, well, war is hell. And I agree. We should eliminate war. That's why I see, world peace through nuclear disarmament and a fundamental rethinking of how we organize human obligations, power, and violence. So multi-sides, risk, morality, existential risk, cost, and I think that it's unfortunate that just straight up saying that something is bullshit gets me as far as it has at times. That was the state and remains the state so often of our discussions around nuclear weapons. And so I think fundamentally, like, the ability of me to do that register linguistic and cognitive performance is what also allows me to say, this is bullshit at the end of the day with laser cat memes about ballistic missile defense and, you know, a picture of the book, because I've usually done the reading. So
Right.
sorry, go on. I apologize.
No, it's great. So the way that I would maybe respond to it, kind of pivoting it to being an artist who makes
Also
work
an
that
arbiter.
well, I make work in a way that relies on doing some amount of research and having some conversance with jargon and understanding history and some amount of the science, and to speak as to why is that the case for me. I'd put myself in relationship to you know to Kay's work. So Kay had a pretty profound personal connection with his grandfather. He knew him as a child, and his grandfather was a writer, a poet, a scholar, and left behind, you know, quite a written record of achievement and um, you know, kind of like professing his belief and insight from being a survivor. And so Kay can kind of draw on that relationship and what his grandfather left behind to articulate his view and his understanding, his feeling about the theme that we work on. Whereas my grandfather was very secretive. I did not know him well, even though he died at a, you know, I was a similar age when he died to the age Kay was when his grandfather died. But the guy was, you know, he was secretive enough that he had two families that didn't know about each other. He had two children born to him on the same day to different mothers that didn't know about each other for 20 years. Um, his politics, as I understand it from talking to my mother, were far left at a time when someone doing the work he did, that was a little dangerous. So the guy was very secretive. I actually don't know exactly what he did for the Manhattan Project. I have, you know, my research has been leading me closer and closer to it. I have a pretty strong theory about it, which is that he was in Philadelphia at you know, working basically X-raying with really powerful X-ray machines, steel, um, you know, and working for a plant that provided the steel for the um, the Hiroshima bomb's gun barrel, as well as the kind of entryway for Jumbo, if you know what that is. There's this big containment vessel that they were going to use to contain the Trinity bomb, but then ended up just kind of leaving it there to see if they could knock it over and what would happen to it. Anyway, yeah. So I think he worked there, and I think he probably X-rayed that stuff. But I don't know. And so for me, research is my entry point into the work, and then maybe trying to present this technical world and think about what someone like my grandfather might have experienced, what the politics of that time might have been for them, and then kind of pivoting away from there, and then doing that in relationship to what Kay does, kind of building a framing around some of the elements that Kay brings, and kind of allowing space for the audience to kind of find their way in between us, right, and to kind of connect us and become involved with it, and perhaps kind of find their way to a new perspective, which actually kind of goes to one of the questions that's in the chat, and I'll kind of loop it back to that. But so in beginning my foray over these past several years into working in this way, I've been really inspired by your example in avoiding the pit of the seduction of the jargon and of you know, the Nuclear Sublime, and of, you know, basically, I don't know, I think of the Nuclear Sublime as kind of like blowing up kind of the tactical aesthetic of, you know, like alt-right people who festoon their bodies with all this really intense looking, often very cheap, but, you know, impressive and scary looking weaponry. You know, I have 50 knives on me and a whole bunch of ammo cases and, you know, body armor so I can barely walk, but sure, I look scary, right? Blow that up on, you know, into a massive scale, and I feel like there's a lot of similarities of what's at stake with the Nuclear Sublime. So, but that, you know, that can be seductive, especially for someone like me who has a already pretty kind of dark, aggressive aesthetic as a sound designer, as an artist. So it's been good to observe your example and say, no, there's another way, right? So this question that Anna asks in the chat, the Atomic Photographers Guild is an international collective of photographers dedicated to rendering visible locations of nuclear energy and weapon sites. In your view, how important is it for artists to be activists? I think that's a great question. I think that in my personal view, it is not necessary. I would certainly not deign to ever declare that artists must do this or do that generally. but it is certainly welcome. Uh, you know, Kay is welcome to chime in later and correct me if he feels differently about what we do. But I feel like we work adjacent to activism, right? So what we do is not to say we have the answers. Here's the policies we should adopt. Go ahead and do this thing in this particular way, or like, we're not so much creating a rallying cry as we are creating space for questioning, right? So we want an audience to come into experiencing our work and maybe leave changed and unsure, right? Because what we're seeking to do is ask questions and maybe chip away at your surety about the rhetoric you've heard all your life and took for granted, right? So I would say for me, it's actually kind of a little important that my politics exist where they are, and that I can kind of pursue them in that way, and that my art be allowed to be a little more open-ended, right? And to kind of invite people in very broad and complicated ways, and give them a space to churn it over in ways that are comfortable and sometimes uncomfortable for them, but not really kind of determined in the way that I think activism demands. Marty, do you have any thoughts on that? And Anna, feel free to jump in and tell us about what you were thinking about in the question.
Do you want to, Anna? Do you want to, or Miss Anna? Sorry, did you want to say something? You mean?
Oh, go on. It's okay. It's okay. I think it's interesting because we had another session a week before, and from that session, I remember Kay said that art doesn't have to be activism and doesn't have to be connected to activism. So I'm just interested in just to gather different positions on this, because some artists are quite obviously connected to activism more directly, and others, as Andrew said, leaving space for questions, which is also important. I think both positions are important, but interesting to see what you think.
I almost went to law school, and thank you, because oh my God, when you want to talk about I'm working with some lawyers and law students right now at the Harvard Law Center Cyber Law Clinic, who are amazing, awesome, wonderful, dedicated, talented people, and just lovely to work with and to be with. All praise to them, and I'm really glad to have them on my side. As I have to sue the federal government, apparently. That said, going to law school would have exacerbated my worst traits in terms of my argumentativeness, and as my academic training, and this is partly attention in anthropology of making truth claims and our evidentiary basis for doing so, and the generality of the truth claims position that we make or that we choose not to make. And I'm really used to everything being an argument, and trying to get away from that because, like Andrew said, one of the things that I do is I straight up say hey, we should dump the ground-based strategic deterrent, just get rid of ICBMs tomorrow also. We don't need them, they don't do anything, we could just get rid of them tomorrow and nothing in the world.
Those are the big missiles that we would launch at another country across an ocean.
Russia, they're for Russia. They're based in the middle of the country. They overfly Russia. So if we're going to nuke China with them, then we're going to overfly Russia, and we're nuking Russia too. Those are hardened launchers that are probably aimed at counter force targets that are probably aimed at other weapons, hardened targets. It gets very difficult to talk about in some ways. But over half our warheads now are on submarine launched ballistic missiles. In any case, so I would also ask, particularly in America, and also we could talk about Japan and other countries, and Japan, of course, being partly the most salient because they're the ones that America attacked with nuclear weapons, and the politics of the rebuilding and the imaginaries of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, and the multiple of them that exist, and in America, and the multiple of them that exist. In any case, there's a lot of really great comparative work to be done. But in America, especially considering the nature and the hegemonic nature of a particular nuclear mythology that we propagate and present at official heritage sites that is very widely believed, I would suggest that any art that does not automatically reproduce that narrative or lead to its conclusion is inherently potentially activist. And I would also say actually that one of the goals of official heritage sites is to manage the polysemious, the multiple meanings and the potentially counter-hegemonic meanings that can emerge from things on display and the text on display. And so, for example, at one nuclear weapons heritage site that very loudly promotes how, like, you know, we are not telling you how to think, we are not telling you, you know, that the bombs ended the war, like on their maps used to say, even though nuclear weapons ended World War II, and like if you don't get it from the text, didactic text, in the very sort of like implied ways, then one of the docents, most of whom are former complex workers or you know, military, will be sure, unless, well, in any case, we'll probably tell you that that's what happened. And again, there's a representation, right, that the Japanese were going to fight until the last person, and There was one heritage site that I will talk about in my dissertation. Never mind, it involves a racial slur that, but in any case, it was a war bonds poster that involved a racial slur on it, and it was just reproduced with no background, no didactic text other than a date and what it was, and as a, you know, an artifact of World War II. I mean, it's gone now, thank you know, Cthulhu. Also gone is, like, at one heritage site, the only mention of the disproportionate impact of uranium mining on Dene and the Navajo Nation and other, you know, the Pueblo Plateau. So, I mean, these sites are dynamic and changing. The process of obscuring particular parts of our past, including the role of anti-nuclear and nuclear protest movements in shaping the Cold War and nuclear policies in particular, and as options for current political action, are actively being erased and dismembered. So to go back to your question, I'm sorry. Yes, I mean, like, I don't think that the artist has to always, but I think that it's fundamentally difficult, especially on this topic in this country, to create something that deals with it that isn't inherently, I mean, everything is inherently political if we want to go there, but then we're explaining everything without nothing. But art is more intensely so, especially because of art's positioning in our culture, in our society, rather. I'm sorry, I hate the word culture. I'm a cultural anthropologist and I hate it. And I believe in, you know, a diversity of tactics also, right? Like my ability to point to the work that Andrew and that Kay and that others have done, and to talk, you know, it's another perspective. And again, like, how do you conceptualize 200,000 people dead? How do you conceptualize 1 million dead? How do you conceptualize Chicago being a 7-mile crater? Like, these are things that art, in particular, is especially suited for, I think, getting us to both think about and to potentially think about in a way that gets us to relate to it in an efficacious, meaningful manner.
Diversity of tactics is an excellent framing.
It's not original to me.
No, but it's appropriate. It's from this.
I love it.
It's very much of this moment, right? So that I first heard that the terminology in the street, right, in protests,
yep.
where the call, you know, from many folks is to not be a protest police, right? To not, you know, whatever they're doing over there, it's not your business unless they're hurting your folks, right?
Yep.
And so diversity of tactics will ultimately yield better success. And I think that's kind of the way I take it with your question, Anna, right? So while I don't feel that my work is directly activist, I love and appreciate those who are working in that mode. And do you want to follow up, Anna?
Can I ask something else then? Martin, so do you think nuclear sublime then could be activism as well?
As a semiotic anthropologist, I will never say no to, like, oh, this can't mean that, right? Because something always means something to someone in some situation. potentially, I think in our society, the nuclear sublime, well, okay, yes. So Harold Agnew, for instance, absolutely believe so. Harold Agnew, who was director of Los Alamos for a long time, very, like if you say his name, any weaponeer, well, you know, Harold. And I got released to me through the FOIA Act, a picture of him next to a barracuda that he had caught in the Pacific while there for nuclear testing. You should really check out in any case. Right, so those sort of moments of the banal, like that intersection of the apocalyptic and the banal, are something that I find very productive and fascinating to think about and to work with. And so like, you know, the image or the story of service members having to pick up dying and charred birds from thermonuclear weapon testing in the Pacific, like, or pictures of people injured in the bombs, right? The atomic bomb casualty commission pictures are very abstracted or very sublime, or are very abstracted, right? They're oftentimes do not include the whole body, only a portion of the so-called injury that they were interested in. So you get a very abstracted picture of like a keloid scar. At the same time, some of the pictures mobilized of people's injuries from those approach what I would call the sublime, and basically war porn, right? You know, where you see it and the depth of the violence to the human body makes you gasp. And at the same time, though, you know, you as, oh hell, what is her name? Elaine Scarry points out, right, it's always difficult, oftentimes difficult for us to relate to other bodies in pain. And so one of the pictures that I recently shared with Andrew was of a woman and her child, a child with rice balls, you know, and they had bandages and so on, and they were both looking at the camera. And I see that, I think, as a much better representation, or, you know, picture, like, do you get what I'm kind of saying? Like, you can move into the sublime with the depth of injury to human bodies. And this is one of the things that I have about like shadows. So at the end, which of course obviously relates to this work and its name, Elongated Shadows. So at one of the heritage sites that I'm very, very familiar with, and it's Nagasaki and Hiroshima section, there are no physically injured people. Also, all the pictures are taken by an American. There's one picture of a well-looking, please pardon me if I mispronounce her name, Sadaki, who died of leukemia, you know, and some peace cranes. But there's not a picture like of the woman and her child with the rice ball, who both are injured. And yet the focus is on their humanity, I think, in the picture, and it humanizes them rather than reducing them solely to their injury and their bodily harm. And it also, you know, suggests a sense for them of agency and ability and survival and endurance, which is not to say that there isn't, you know, I don't know that there's a real, like, I think it's kind of obscene to take, for example, you know, the picture of the dead children who have been burned. Like, I don't find that extremely useful. I find it obscene, and I think it's exploitative, potentially, or often. And I think that that's the sort of thing, you know, that you move into a nuclear sublime with, or into a sublime with. So I think, you know, for me, I think we should always be extraordinarily careful when using images of, you know, the people who have been impacted by, I mean, in part, oftentimes they were taken under very coercive conditions. There's a lot there. And we can ask about the same thing with regards, you know, to ongoing harms with uranium mines not cleaned up on the Navajo Nation. And I keep mentioning that in part because it is such a massive thing. In part, I am located here. In part, I mean, for fuck's sake, like Grand Junction got cleaned up. You know, uranium tailings and construction everywhere. But during the active period of uranium mining on the Navajo Nation, like 90% of it didn't have electricity as they mined the most the apotheosis of high technology element. And you still have people who have to drive miles for water because it's uranium, you know. I'm sorry, this is really getting ahead and far from your question. So the whole point being, I think that the representation of harm, injury, always has to be done in consideration, and preferably, if not always, with consultation with the frontline communities and the people involved. And this comes to another issue where we are not letting the people that we have injured and killed talk.
Marty, I want to jump to another question from the chat, which comes from Henry. As someone who is interested in the Freedom of Information Act and finding information, where do you think the line should be drawn between public information and national security? I understand that this could be problematic for your own research, but should we protect some information?
Obviously, some information should be protected. I would argue. So that's not. So let me whack that obviously.
Oh, so it's not obvious. So you'd have to argue it, huh?
Yes, exactly. Right, and the use of obviously as a metapragmatic marker implies it's you know we can analyze it. I could talk for an hour on this literally. You don't want to hear it. I don't like to think of it as like a balance between secrecy because it's not. Right, there's no setting on a scale of intensity between secrecy and openness, right? It's in part a situational thing. Do I need to know the exact design details for certain, for certain weapons? Probably not. I am okay with, keeping classified, like if, although keeping information about like gas centrifuge production, restricted sort of thing. Of course, I would also much prefer international control of enrichment and reprocessing and fuel production, but we seem to have missed that boat so far. It's situational. So for example, at one heritage site, one of the didactic texts about the Davy Crockett, which remember is that like 60-pound weapon designed for infantry that either 2 or a 5-person team could fire at some, why do I care about the yield? Well, A, most yields are still classified. And so when you go to heritage sites, they are described as like kiloton range, megaton range. B, there's very rarely, if ever, any sort of calibration of that for you so that you get a sense of what a megaton does, or that, this particular weapon was 25 megatons, it would have turned human beings into flaming torches at 20 miles away, which may then lead you to ask questions like, that seems a little egregious. Why? Right? And for the Davy Crockett weapon, you can back work the yield. It's probably nominally 20 tons. And I filed a FOIA for it, and then I filed a mandatory declassification request for it, and they said, well, we still can't release the yield because it's, doing so would be negative to national security. I assure you the Soviets know, the Russians know, and you have to ask, why does the yield of a weapon that was removed from the stockpile in the 60s matter? You further have to ask, for example, like why we've stopped declassifying the total number of weapons in the US stockpile like last year, especially given, New START offers a really good idea and everybody knows.
Could we draw an analogy to the condition of copyright law where, 100 years ago, something would fall out of being under copyright. I don't know what it was, like 20 years or something. And then over the course of the last 100 years, that duration of time has become extended and extended. And the claim is always, oh, it's to protect the artist. It's so the artist can get paid and their descendants,
Disney.
Whatever. But really it's so that corporate entities
Disney.
Basically Disney, but so corporate entities can continue to exact control and make more and more and more and more money. Would you say that it is a similar kind of force of conservatism that is driving FOIA laws or these regulations and the resistance to putting information in the public domain?
So there's a great difference between the law, the regulation, and practice, which is why I have lawyers now, or had to find lawyers, who are pro bono, because the initial cost. So one of the things I have learned that FOIA, the U.S. So first off, no. Or rather not, I don't think that is the major explanatory factor. Certainly there's a degree of conservatism and a degree of overclassification with regards to certain topics, including like weapon yields and design details and so on, that some people are just uncomfortable with and believe shouldn't be out in the public sphere. And many of the X-Lab people that I have talked to about it have been like, there are a lot of things I wouldn't have released. For example, at one site, there was an exhibit that basically had a mock-up of a levitated pit, levitated core assembly, which I didn't realize until somebody pointed out. And then I felt like, my God, I am totally unequipped to be doing this research because I've been looking at it for 2 years.
When we say levitated pit, what we mean is the central part of the bomb had this pit, which in the first design of the implosion device, the bomb that was dropped in Nagasaki, the tamper and other elements were kind of right up against it. And so the analogy here about why that was maybe not so effective is, imagine trying to drive in a nail with a hammer that you're starting already on the nail and then trying to force it in, versus getting a little bit of a running start and striking it. So they developed a way to kind of float or levitate the pit, to kind of have it suspended so that you'd have that gap, that air gap, and then can more effectively smash it. Bigger, horrible explosion. Yeah.
You can literally double the yield that you can get out of a certain amount of fissile material. And so you can also look at DPRK's nuclear test history, and you can kind of guess what they were trying to do and where they sort of are.
So you're saying you came across an example of a levitated pit mocked up?
Yes, which is really like, and so it clicked for me like why so many of the X-Lab people had been making some muttering about this particular exhibition. Because even though there are declassified documents talking about levitated pits, I don't know that I've ever seen an official lab picture model of one. And the most official heritage sites, like if they have weapons casings on loan from the NNSA, although I FOIA'd for the agreements and they screwed me over on it, and that'll be something I handle after I sue them and get my FOIA powers back. In any case, at this one, the Nuclear Lab provides classification review for their exhibits. And this one got through because it was presented as an art exhibit, basically, because it showed some things that otherwise probably would not have been shown or as easily. I got in significant trouble while I was volunteering for a site, not significant trouble, I got talked to. And then in any case, I got talked to about revealing supposedly, well, it is classified information. Of course, I've never held a classification. And yet I know this information and I'm not supposed to be saying it in the setting because, officially and the weapons casings are lent and you can't say it. And it's like, but literally on the front page, the Secretary of the Air Force talked about this massive storage facility for nuclear weapons about 7 miles away. And it's like, active storage locations are technically classified. So, to go back to your point and to go to my thesis, my dissertation research, yes, that conservatism is part. Also, classification helps you hide shit, like bad decisions, funding, overruns, politically difficult stuff. I've been reading
Broken arrows.
Yes. Oh, I just did a FOIA on that one. And they claimed that there haven't been any since that there haven't been more since 32. I have another FOIA and for another set of accidents, of which there are like 1,000 that don't meet that criteria. They're going to take years for that one. That one, I mean, they may wait till I die for all I know. And that's another, right? So as we talk about all these tactics, what I learned is that the FOIA process as practice is a form of governmentality, a form of regulating the relationship of the person to the state and of official knowledge, and what you can do. And that is reflected in part in our heritage sites. And so, for example, if you again, not knowing the yield of the Davy Crockett, you cannot evaluate the claim that it placed a nuclear capability in the hands of the infantry with acceptable risk, because you can't work out that at the lower delivery ranges, it was going to deliver a, LD-50 dose of radiation and kill half the crew. I mean, that also probably didn't matter because the Soviets would have nuked them already, or they were going to get, shortly. But the point is that information management acts to erode transparency, and transparency is not, as we have seen, not a guarantee of accountability, but accountability is impossible without transparency. And furthermore, in going through the FOIA process, like, justice is expensive. So here's what DOE will do. The National Nuclear Security Agency will do. They will fuck you over. Stage 1, stage 2, you appeal to DOE. DOE agrees with NNSA despite all the statute and case law. And then you have to go look for a lawyer. And the first, they tell you it's $10,000 straight up. And this is in a situation where I would say the case is very strong and they had a capability of recovering attorney's fees. I do not have $10,000. Most people do not have $10,000. This is a consistent critique of the US quote unquote justice system, court system, is that it's designed for rich people, right? Because most of us need justice much faster, or we need the court process to run much faster, and we're dealing with amounts of only several hundred to several $1,000s, right? But so that is your only recourse, is to appeal to OHA and then sue. And you're asking, when you appeal to OHA, the bad people, you know, so it's a form of, and one of the things that queer autoethnography, and I would offer oftentimes, you know, art, oftentimes in its reflexivity and its criticality and its critical nature, and so on, you know, and its reflection on the society that it's embedded in, also serves some of the same, many of the same purposes or overlaps with, is the ability to, you know, okay, I've gone through this process, like, I can talk about feelings, like, wow, I feel really, you know, I don't want to do this anymore. This has literally, so to get to the point where I can once again file Freedom of Information Acts will have taken anywhere from 18 months to 3 years, and have cost me hundreds of hours, and hundreds of hours of free legal. You know, and that is what the system is designed to do, is to make it. And of course, this is a change from the 90s when you had a sort of mea culpa and the openness and the transparency, and they released a bunch of stuff. But I mean, you also have to look at what was released. And I have noticed that certain requests, like if you ask about the weapons usability of plutonium dioxide, I got GLOMARD for that. So by GLOMARD, they said we can neither confirm nor deny, which means, yes, they've studied it and they're not going to admit it. You know, on the other hand, well, actually, on the other hand, it took me 2 years to get like color pictures of plutonium tetrafluoride. 2 years,
right,
to get Los Alamos Tocopheros. So,
which, by the way, I hope those of you who are with us get a chance to see the pictures that Marty got, because they're kind of strangely beautiful, and
they're part of a process that you never.
Right. So actually, I want to take this opportunity here to put a little bow on our conversation tonight, and to thank everybody for joining us. I'm throwing in the chat some things for you all, because we didn't get to answer all the questions, and these are complicated, big issues and questions that y'all have. So I invite you to continue the conversation with me and with Marty via his Twitter, which is amazing and entertaining and terrifying and wonderful.
And has cats.
Yes, cats, daily cats. Via his Patreon, which is equally insightful and just an amazing resource if this is the kind of thing you're into, if you're a sicko like me. And I've also thrown here a link to some material that he's sharing with us all. So thank you, Abby. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Marty.